Stay free. See it first on Rumble.
Mate, we wanted to talk to you actually about the expansion of NATO. Finland recently joining NATO, and also the sort of broad framing of NATO as a force for good in the world. And if you wouldn't mind tying that all into the sort of current show trial of Donald Trump, and how the exaggeration of these misdemeanors into felonies is a convenient way to maintain a convenient framing of American politics at a time when perhaps we could be looking at more important geopolitical issues.
Well, the indictment of Trump ties into issues like the expansion of NATO, because back when Trump first broke into the political scene in 2015, 2016, one of the things that he was saying that really freaked out the political establishment in the U.S. and other NATO states like the UK was that he was questioning the existence of NATO. And people couldn't believe someone could possibly, in the political spectrum, say such a thing. And I think that was one of the factors in all this freak out about Trump and all the motivation to then paint him as a Russian agent, is because he was actually saying things that you're not supposed to say inside of respectable NATO state politics. And we've seen now in the real world the result of NATO and this drive to expand it in this proxy war in Ukraine. The fact we're having this war now is an outgrowth of a 3-decade-long policy of pushing NATO to Russia's borders, trying to bring in states like Ukraine and Georgia, and doing so despite pledges to the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War that we're not going to expand NATO one more inch to the east, and that's been violated, and that's a major reason why we have this war today. So Finland joining the club is just one more provocation. It's not, to me, as serious as the attempt to bring Ukraine in, because Ukraine has an actual historical tie to Russia. There are millions of people inside Ukraine who consider themselves to be ethnic Russians. Parts of Ukraine used to be a part of Russia. And Russian officials have long warned that any attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO would put Russia in a bad position, because basically, as William Burns, the then ambassador to the U.S., wrote back in 2008, if Ukraine joins NATO, Russia feared that would trigger a civil war, and that would force Russia to intervene on the side of people who support Russia. And that's pretty much what has happened. And so Finland joining NATO, I don't think is something Russia is too concerned about, but certainly expanding NATO's borders to Russia does increase the tensions. And the idea that NATO is supposed to be defensive is just, as you've talked about, is a joke. I mean, look at its recent record: destroying Libya, invading Afghanistan, destroying Yugoslavia and turning that into separate states. I mean, that's the real nature of NATO. And the idea that it's there to protect people is just completely undermined by its own record.
They have an explicit relationship with the military-industrial complex. Is there any evidence that they are involved in the brokerage of arms deals, that they facilitate it, that an expansion of NATO somehow leads to the expansion of the military-industrial complex? And also, Aaron, I just to say that is fascinating. When Trump, who I'm not broadly speaking he's not someone I blithely support. I enjoy him as an establishment wrecking ball, I do have to say. But when he sort of mentions something like, don't have to be in NATO, there's something like that I enjoy about that kind of anarchic and sort of outsider perspective. So I just wonder if you can just talk about NATO's relationship with the military-industrial complex and the possibility of disbanding NATO.
Yeah, well, on Trump, I mean, that's why elites hate him so much. Not because he's actually really a threat to their agenda, but sometimes he blurts out the wrong things. So he'll question the existence of NATO, while still policy-wise, he encouraged NATO states to spend more on the military-industrial complex. So policy-wise, he pretty much continued the NATO agenda, but sometimes, occasionally, he'll speak the truth, and he'll say the wrong things. Also, in Syria, for example, when he announced that U.S. troops were staying, after he initially tried to withdraw them, he said, we're staying to take the oil. And you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say we're there to fight terrorism and spread democracy. So that's why they don't like him, and that's why there's constantly attempts to undermine him, not because he's actual policy-wise, he's a threat to, the conventional agenda, but because sometimes he just speaks out of turn. And yes, in terms of NATO's relationship to the military-industrial complex, if you look at the multiple rounds of NATO expansion and how that's been received in the U.S. Congress, which has to vote to approve these expansions, every time that happens, there's a massive influx of lobbying money by the military-industrial complex in support of NATO expansion, because the military-industrial complex recognizes that NATO expansion is hugely profitable for them. Back in the 1990s, there was a lobby group in the U.S. called the Committee to Expand NATO or something like that. And it was headed by a guy named Bruce Jackson. But that wasn't Bruce Jackson's only job. Bruce Jackson's day job was that he was a vice president at Lockheed Martin. So he recognized that expanding NATO was very good for Lockheed Martin. So yes, I mean, because if you expand NATO, you have to your military has to be up to NATO standards, which means spending billions and billions of dollars on weapons. So there's a huge connection there. And that's why Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, he's not really a general of anything. He doesn't have a military role. He's just basically an arms dealer. He's an arms lobbyist. That's what he is. He's there to sell the public on the need to spend more money on weapons.
Aaron, you know Russia arrested that Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, and the Biden administration are up in arms saying you can't just arrest journalists and put them in prison without trial. What do you think? You can't just use the Espionage Act as a catch-all way of arresting people, dissident voices that you don't agree with or approve of. What do you make of that while dear old Julian Assange is banged up in Belmarsh here in Blighty, and dear Edward Snowden abides in exile in Russia? Is there some hypocrisy there?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think this arrest of this Wall Street Journal happened just as Assange marked 1,000 days inside Belmarsh, this maximum security gulag inside Britain. And that was on top of all the years he spent locked up in the Ecuadorian embassy because he couldn't leave, or else he would be put in prison then. So, yes, of course, it's massively hypocritical. It's a joke to see NATO state leaders in the US and UK and elsewhere complain about the arrest of this Wall Street Journal reporter. And it's just like, I can't even think about Assange sometimes. It's so depressing. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's so depressing.
It's like I have to try and think there must be something I'm not understanding about this, because otherwise it shows that aside from aesthetics, we do live in a kind of banalized tyranny, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to put journalists in prison without trial and claim it was somehow legitimate. So yeah, I went to see Julian Assange when he was in that embassy. He later described that in his diaries as the worst day of his incarceration. I'm in touch with Julian Assange's wife, and I feel like it's, in a way, I hold on to the idea of Assange and Snowden when I'm attacked for being far right or a conspiracy theorist, because they're kind of the ace, aren't they? They're dual aces in the pack. Right? Your liberal, righteous agenda, what is it doing about this, and why can't it address it? It's kind of a Vulcan death grip on their bullshit, because they have to sort of go, they have to sort of shut down the debate there. And that's when you know what the establishment is. So I suppose, aside from the sort of deep personal agony that they as a family and the individuals must be facing, I feel that they are sort of avatars of what the reality of our sort of deep state corruption is.
Absolutely. I mean, no one in the world has done more to expose state crimes than Julian Assange. And for his services, rather than being given every journalistic award in the world, which he deserves, he's being caged in a gulag with no sign of him being able to get out. I think the plan from those torturing him and imprisoning him is just to hold him for as long as they can behind bars and hope he dies behind bars. That seems to be the plan. And the media in the U.S. especially is totally complicit in this. There sometimes, establishment journals speak up in defense of Julian, but not nearly to the level that they should be. And they still run all these smear pieces that take part in the propaganda effort to demonize him. And so we're all just sitting by and watching it happen as, the most important journalist in I think in Western history is being murdered, tortured, It's just unbelievable. And so, yes, so what Russia has done to this Wall Street Journal reporter, by all accounts, it looks terrible. I do, though, have to question the wisdom of his editors who sent this reporter to a really sensitive Russian military-industrial complex site and asking questions of people. They must have known that this would arouse suspicion from Russian authorities and would possibly put this reporter in danger. So I hope, of course, that he's freed, immediately. But I do have to question the wisdom of whoever sent him to this really sensitive site to ask these questions, especially at a time of such high tensions between the U.S. and Russia. People are going to be used as pawns to negotiate for the release of other prisoners. And it looks like this Wall Street Journal reporter has gotten caught up in that.